I'll never forget the look on Patricia's face when the waiter placed that leather folder on the table. But let me back up, because you need to understand how we got here. My name is Naya, and for 3 years I'd been married to Michael Henderson. On paper, we were the perfect couple. He was a corporate attorney at a mid-level firm downtown, and I worked in commercial real estate investment. We met at a charity gala, one of those stuffy events where everyone pretends to care about causes, while really just networking. Michael was charming that night, funny, attentive. He didn't flinch when I told him what I did for a living. He seemed genuinely impressed. But there was always this tension underneath everything. His mother, Patricia Henderson, made sure of that. From the moment Michael introduced us, Patricia looked at me like I was something stuck to the bottom of her Louboutins. She had this way of smiling with her mouth while her eyes stayed cold and calculating. At our engagement party, she pulled me aside and asked if I was sure I understood the kind of family I was marrying into, the kind of standards they upheld, the kind of legacy they protected. I smiled back and told her I understood perfectly. What Patricia didn't know, what she never bothered to find out, was that while Michael made a comfortable 6 figures, I made triple that. My company specialized in acquiring undervalued commercial properties, renovating them, and either flipping them or turning them into revenue streams. I'd started with one small building my grandmother left me when I was 23, and by 30, I had a portfolio worth $8 million. But I never corrected Patricia's assumptions, never flashed my success in her face. I let her believe whatever made her feel superior because, honestly, I had better things to do than prove myself to a woman who'd already decided who I was. Michael knew about my work, of course, but somewhere along the way, I think he started believing his mother's narrative too. He'd make little comments about how lucky I was to have found someone stable, how his career gave us security. He stopped asking about my deals and started treating my job like a cute hobby I'd eventually outgrow once we had children. The final straw came on our 3rd wedding anniversary. Michael insisted we celebrate at Marcella's, this upscale Italian restaurant in the heart of the city. White tablecloths, chandeliers dripping with crystals, a wine list that required a sommelier to navigate. It was the kind of place Patricia loved because she could see and be seen. And of course, she was joining us. Michael said it was just dinner, just the 3 of us, something intimate. But I knew better. Patricia never did anything without an agenda. We arrived at 7 on a Friday evening. The restaurant was packed, every table filled with well-dressed professionals celebrating the end of the work week. The hostess greeted us warmly and led us to a corner table near the windows, one of the best seats in the house. Patricia arrived 10 minutes later, making an entrance in a cream Chanel suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She air-kissed my cheeks, leaving a smudge of coral lipstick that I had to discreetly wipe away. Then she settled into her chair, ordered a dirty martini before even looking at the menu, and smiled at Michael like I wasn't even there. The first hour was bearable. Patricia dominated the conversation, talking about some fundraiser she was planning for the hospital auxiliary board. Michael nodded along, occasionally asking questions that fed her ego. I sipped my wine and studied the restaurant, noting the renovations they'd done since I last been here. New lighting fixtures, refinished floors. The bar had been completely redesigned. Then Patricia turned her attention to me. She asked about work with that condescending tone she had perfected, the one that suggested she was just being polite by acknowledging I had a job at all. I gave her the basics, a few properties in development, some negotiations in progress, nothing too detailed. She nodded absently, already bored, and then she said it, the thing that changed everything. She set down her martini glass, looked directly at me and said, "You know, Naya, you really are lucky that Michael chose you. I mean, let's be honest, sweetheart. Someone like you, from your background, marrying into a family like ours, that doesn't happen every day. You should be grateful he saw past all of that." The table went quiet. I felt my chest tighten, that familiar heat rising up my neck, but I didn't react. I'd learned a long time ago that women like Patricia fed on reactions. Instead, I took a slow sip of my wine and waited. Michael shifted in his seat, uncomfortable but silent. He didn't defend me, didn't tell his mother she was out of line. He just looked down at his plate and cut another piece of his osso buco. Patricia continued, warming to her subject. She talked about how different our worlds were, how she'd had concerns about the marriage from the beginning, but she'd kept an open mind, how she hoped I understood the responsibility that came with being a Henderson, how important it was to maintain certain standards, certain appearances. She said all of this with a smile, like she was giving me advice, like she was doing me a favor. And Michael said nothing. That's when I knew. This wasn't just Patricia being Patricia. Michael had allowed this, maybe even encouraged it. This dinner wasn't about celebrating our anniversary. It was about putting me in my place, reminding me where I stood in their hierarchy. I waited until she finished her little speech. Then I smiled back at her, that same polite smile I'd been giving her for 3 years, and excused myself to use the restroom. But I didn't go to the restroom. I went to find Antonio. Antonio Russo was the general manager of Marcella's, a sharp Italian man in his 50s who'd been running high-end restaurants for 30 years. We'd met 6 months earlier when I'd approached him about a business opportunity. The building that housed Marcella's was owned by an investment group that was looking to liquidate some of their assets. The restaurant itself was successful, but the owners wanted out. I'd made them an offer, a very generous offer, and 3 weeks ago, the deal had closed. I found Antonio near the kitchen, reviewing reservations with the hostess. When he saw me, his face lit up. He excused himself and met me halfway, kissing both my cheeks in that warm Italian way. I told him what I needed. He listened, his expression darkening as I explained what just happened at my table. Then he nodded once, sharp and decisive, and told me he'd take care of it. I returned to the table. Patricia was in the middle of another story, this one about some society wedding she had attended. Michael was laughing at something she had said. Neither of them acknowledged my return. I sat down and waited. 5 minutes later, Antonio appeared at our table. He was carrying a leather folder, the kind that usually held the check, but this wasn't the check. He greeted Patricia and Michael with professional warmth, then turned to me with unmistakable deference. He apologized for the interruption and explained that there was a small matter requiring my signature, something about the liquor license renewal that couldn't wait until Monday. Patricia frowned, confused. Michael looked up from his wine, equally puzzled. I thanked Antonio and opened the folder. Inside was the deed to the property, my name, clear as day, listed as the sole owner of the building, and by extension, the restaurant operating within it. Also included were the management contracts, the lease agreements, everything that proved this place, this upscale Italian restaurant where Patricia loved to be seen, belonged to me. I made a show of reviewing the documents, taking my time, letting the silence stretch. Then I pulled out a pen and signed where Antonio had marked with small colored tabs. Patricia was staring now. Michael had gone very still. I closed the folder and handed it back to Antonio. He thanked me, called me by my full name for emphasis, Naya Chin Henderson, owner, and then asked if there was anything else I needed this evening, anything at all. I told him everything was perfect, the food, the service, the ambiance, all perfect. He smiled, gave a small bow, and walked away. I picked up my wine glass and took a sip, letting them process what had just happened. Patricia's mouth had fallen open slightly. The color had drained from her perfectly made-up face. She looked from me to the retreating Antonio, to Michael, and back to me again. Michael found his voice first. He asked what that was about, though I could tell he'd already figured it out. He just couldn't quite believe it. I set down my wine glass and leaned back in my chair. I told them the truth, simply and without drama. I owned the building. I'd purchased it 6 months ago as part of a larger acquisition portfolio. The restaurant came with the property, which made me Antonio's landlord and effectively the owner of the establishment. Patricia tried to recover. She stammered something about why I'd never mentioned it, why I'd kept it a secret. I looked her directly, no smile this time, and said I'd never kept it a secret. I'd simply never discussed my business ventures with people who weren't interested in hearing about them, people who'd already decided I was someone to be pitied rather than respected. The silence that followed was delicious. Michael tried to laugh it off. He said something about me being full of surprises, but his voice was tight. He was doing the math now, realizing that I'd been sitting here for 3 years, listening to his mother's condescension, his own subtle dismissals, while quietly building an empire neither of them had bothered to notice. Patricia couldn't even look at me. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for her martini. She'd been holding court in this restaurant for years, treating it like her personal domain. And now she had to sit there knowing that every time she walked through those doors, she was walking into my property. I signaled to our waiter and asked for the dessert menu. I ordered the tiramisu because I suddenly had an appetite. Michael and Patricia declined dessert. They declined anything else at all. They just sat there frozen while I enjoyed my anniversary dinner. When the check came, Antonio delivered it personally. He placed it in front of Michael, as was customary, but he made sure to catch my eye. He thanked us for dining with them this evening and hoped we'd return soon. Michael paid the bill without a word. We left the restaurant in complete silence. Patricia said a clipped goodbye in the parking lot and drove away without her usual performance. Michael and I drove home separately. He'd met me at the restaurant after work, and I'd come from a property showing. When we both arrived at our house, he followed me inside and finally exploded. He demanded to know why I'd humiliated his mother like that, why I'd never told him about the restaurant, why I let him look like a fool. I set down my purse on the countertop and turned to face him. I told him I hadn't humiliated his mother. His mother had humiliated herself by assuming I was someone to be pitied, by treating me like charity he'd taken on out of the goodness of his heart. He tried to argue. He said his mother meant well. She was just protective. She came from a different generation. I cut him off. I asked him why he hadn't defended me, why he'd sat there at our anniversary dinner and let her talk to me like that, why he'd never once in 3 years of marriage stood up for me when she'd made her little comments about my background, my family, my worth. He didn't have an answer for that. I told him I was done. Done pretending I needed his stability, done diminishing myself to make him feel bigger, done letting his mother treat me like I should be grateful for the privilege of being a Henderson. The truth was, I'd been the one providing stability all along. The house we lived in, I'd bought it, paid cash from my business profits while he was still carrying law school loans. The car he drove, I'd co-signed for it when his credit wasn't quite good enough on its own. Every vacation we'd taken, every nice dinner, every luxury his mother praised him for providing, I'd quietly funded half of it, and sometimes more. I'd never said anything because I didn't need to prove anything, because I loved him, or thought I did, and I believed love meant being a team, supporting each other without keeping score. But there's a difference between not keeping score and being taken for granted. And I was done being taken for granted. Michael stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Maybe he was. He tried to apologize. He said he talked to his mother. He said things would change. But I knew they wouldn't. Because the problem wasn't just Patricia. The problem was that Michael had never truly seen me as an equal. He'd been comfortable with his mother's narrative because deep down, some part of him believed it too. I told him I wanted a divorce. He spent the next 2 weeks trying to change my mind. Flowers, apologies, promises. He even confronted his mother, apparently, though she never apologized to me directly. But it was too late. Something had shifted that night at Marcella's, or maybe it had been shifting for a long time and I'd just finally acknowledged it. The divorce was relatively quick and clean. I kept what was mine. He kept what was his. The house was mine. Most of the assets were mine. Michael walked away with his pride wounded, but his bank account intact. Patricia tried to start rumors in her social circles, painting me as a gold digger who trapped her son. But those rumors died quickly when people started learning the truth about my portfolio, when they realized Michael had been the one benefiting financially from the marriage, not me. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I received an invitation to join the hospital auxiliary board that Patricia chaired. They wanted my expertise in real estate and fundraising. They also wanted my money. I declined politely. As for Marcella's, I kept it. Antonio is still the general manager, and the restaurant is thriving. I have dinner there at least once a month, always at that same corner table with the best view in the house. I've seen Patricia there once since the divorce. She was with some friends, and she saw me sitting at my table. For a moment, our eyes met. Then she looked away quickly and requested to be seated on the opposite side of the restaurant. I sipped my wine and smiled. Here's what I learned from all of this. Your worth isn't determined by who you marry or who accepts you into their family. Your worth is inherent, and if the people around you can't see it, that's their limitation, not yours. I spent 3 years trying to be enough for people who'd already decided I wasn't. I dimmed my own light so Michael wouldn't feel overshadowed. I stayed quiet about my success so Patricia wouldn't feel threatened. But the thing about dimming your light is that eventually you start believing you were never that bright to begin with. You start accepting treatment you'd never tolerate if you remembered your own power. That night at Marcella's, when the waiter brought over that deed, I wasn't trying to humiliate anyone. I was simply refusing to be diminished anymore. I was reminding myself and them of who I actually was. Sometimes the most powerful form of revenge isn't elaborate or loud. Sometimes it's just living your truth and letting other people confront their own assumptions. Patricia had spent 3 years treating me like someone who should be grateful for scraps from her table. The irony is that she'd been eating at mine all along. Now I'm building something bigger. My portfolio has grown to include residential developments, mixed-use properties, and 3 more restaurants in partnership with talented chefs and managers like Antonio. I date when I feel like it, but I'm in no rush. I'm focused on my empire, my legacy, the thing I'm building that has nothing to do with anyone's last name but my own. And every time I walk into Marcella's, every time I sit at that table by the window and order the osso buco, I remember the look on Patricia's face when she realized that the woman she'd been calling lucky was actually the one holding all the cards. So here's my question for you, because I genuinely want to know what you think. Was I wrong to let that moment happen the way it did? Should I have pulled Patricia aside privately instead of letting her find out at the table? Did I cross a line by choosing our anniversary dinner to make my point? Or did she get exactly the reality check she'd been asking for every time she treated me like I was beneath her? Let me know in the comments. I'm curious whether you think I went too far, or if sometimes people need to be confronted with the truth in the same public way they chose to disrespect you. Because at the end of the day, I have no regrets. I just want to know if you would have done the same thing, or if you would have handled it differently.